We'll be talking about the neural and physiological mechanisms of mindfulness-based pain relief. And just to let you guys know, so most of the research I'm talking about today was done out of my doctoral lab. Dr. Fadel Zidan was my PI. He's now at UCSD heading up their mindfulness center. Lots of cool work and publications coming out of there, but none of this work was actually done at UT Southwestern, but that is where I currently am residing. And also just to let you guys know, all of this was done in healthy controls, studying experimentally induced pain. Our goal was really to understand the mechanisms behind mindfulness-based pain relief so that these interventions can be appropriately tailored to target the patient populations that it will be most effective for. So that's, this is a preclinical of a talk, but there's lots of good implications for moving forward. So as you guys all know, chronic pain is a huge problem. It affects over 100 million Americans. For reference, cancer affects about 12 million Americans. So it's a huge pervasive problem that we are just surrounded in. And as some of you might be aware, the CDC in 2016 put out guidelines that recommend non-pharmacological and non-opioidergic management as first-line therapy for chronic pain. But what are the, this is a super fun slide, but why would we even start to think about cognitive therapies or emotional therapies or anything like this for treating pain? Well, there are just tons of cognitive and emotional factors that go into creating our individual experience of pain. It's an incredibly subjective experience. Things like your mood, your expectations regarding the pain, your perceived control of the painful stimulus, as well as your attention. All of these things go into affecting how much pain you actually experience. There's actually been studies showing that if you expose somebody to an unpleasant odor, it can actually increase the unpleasantness of the pain. Further, if you induce fear or disgust in somebody, it can decrease your pain intensity and unpleasantness thresholds. So why do we think about mindfulness? Well, mindfulness is actually really good at targeting some of these cognitive and emotional factors that go into formulating your experience of pain. So for example, mindfulness can alter your anticipation of a noxious stimulus, and it can improve your positive mood. And these are just two examples. I hugely anticipate Christmas in a positive way. And then this is my baby puppy. She's not a baby anymore, but she greatly improves my mood. But those are two things that meditation is really, really good at doing. But what actually is mindfulness meditation? So John Kabat-Zinn, who's kind of considered the founder of Western mindfulness as we know it. If you guys are familiar with MBSR, he is the one who came up with that. So he defines mindfulness as awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. That last part is something that's left out sometimes, but I think it's very, very poignant that we give some context to it. But how do we actually practice mindfulness? How did we teach it in the lab? So it was similar and a little bit different to what I led you guys in at the beginning of the talk. So we teach participants to maintain their focus on a specific object, specifically the breath. So we tell them, to focus on the changing sensations of the breath. And then when arising thoughts or sensations pass through their consciousness, they're just taught to acknowledge those non-judgmentally and then gently return to focusing on the breath. And this is what we would teach people in brief interventions. We would teach 4 days of training, 20 minutes a day, and then we would study how active meditation influenced pain just after that brief amount of training. And we would screen people and make sure they were meditation naive. Because in the lab, we were really interested in what is the dosage of meditation that's required in order to show benefits. A lot of the research is focused on long-term trainings, MBSR, things that, some people might not be able to do 8 to 12 weeks of training. So mindfulness meditation has been shown to attenuate both clinical and experimentally induced pain. A lot of the clinical pain studies have been in things like fibromyalgia, chronic low back pain. And then there was a recent trial that actually came out of Wake Forest showing that MBSR can impact certain pain outcomes, pain catastrophizing, depression, in chronic migraine patients. And it also did improve pain, but interestingly, not more than a education control, but it did improve those outcomes like quality of life, depression, pain catastrophizing more than the health education, which I think is really interesting because sometimes it's not about the actual painful stimulus, it's about how we are handling it, how we're coping with it. And then we showed in the lab that brief mindfulness meditation training, that 4 days, 20 minutes a day, can significantly reduce experimentally induced pain. And I'll get into kind of how we did that. So how is this happening in the brain? What exactly is going on? So before I get into that, I want to tell you guys a little bit about our methods. This is supposed to be a very brief talk, so I'm not going to get too much into the weeds. But the way we induced the noxious stimulus was we would place a thermal probe on the back of participants' right calves, and they would receive a 5-minute stimulus. During that 5-minute time period, the temperature would oscillate between a 12-second plateau of 49 degrees Celsius, which is pretty noxious, and that would alternate with a 35-degree Celsius stimulus. It would alternate like that for 5 minutes. And this probe is very safe. It does not cause tissue damage. That's kind of what these probes are known for. So then at the end of the 5-minute stimulus, we would ask participants to rate their pain intensity and pain unpleasantness using a sliding visual analog scale. So you can see it, one of these. So they would rate their pain intensity or unpleasantness from no pain sensation to most intense or unpleasant imaginable. And to help understand this differentiation, so intensity, we told them, is analogous to the volume of a sound if you were listening to a sound, whereas unpleasantness is analogous to how much that sound might bother you. Very different types of things. And then, and so kind of a brief overview of most of the experimental paradigms we did. Participants would come in day one, we'd get kind of baseline psychological assessments, pain testing, maybe neuroimaging, physiological measures, whatever we were studying in that study. Those results aren't presented here. Then they would undergo a 4-day, 20 minutes per day training of mindfulness meditation and what we talked about earlier. Then they would come in after that 4-day training and they would do the experimental session where they would undergo this noxious stimulus while they were not meditating, and we would collect neuroimaging, physiological, psychological data, pain ratings. Then they would begin meditating, and we would administer the heat stimuli again, and again collect pain intensity, unpleasantness, any physiological or neurological measure. And then we would compare those. What do those outcomes look like in the presence of heat while meditating compared to in the presence of heat while not meditating? And each of these studies that we did have a control group. They would vary depending what they were, to kind of an inactive control to a pretty robust placebo control. We won't get into all those weeds today, but there's some interesting stuff there too. So what we show kind of across multiple studies is that meditation does decrease pain. In this one study, meditation decreased pain intensity by about 40% compared to when they were not meditating, and pain unpleasantness by about 57%. And what we found is those reductions in pain intensity were associated with increased activation in the right anterior insula, which is the region involved in interoceptive awareness. Those reductions in pain intensity were also associated with higher activation in the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in things like cognitive and emotional regulation. And then those decreases in pain unpleasantness were associated with increased activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in your contextual evaluation of a noxious stimulus. Those reductions in pain unpleasantness were also associated with decreased activation in the thalamus, which, as we both know, is kind of the relay station. So ascending nociceptive information ascends, reaches the thalamus, and goes through the thalamus in order to reach the other areas of the cortex. So additionally, what we found is that meditators, when they were not meditating, so when they were just at rest, experiencing the painful stimulus but not meditating, they had increased activation in the primary somatosensory cortex corresponding to the right calf. So we're all kind of familiar with the homunculus, or maybe we are, maybe we aren't, but the homunculus kind of that region of the somatosensory, or that layout of the somatosensory cortex that corresponds to different regions of the body. So this is the region of about the right calf. So that makes sense. They're undergoing a painful stimulus. It ascends through the thalamus into the primary somatosensory cortex. What's really interesting is that when individuals are meditating in the presence of pain, it looks like they have diminished activation in that primary somatosensory cortex. So our hypothesis of what's going on here is that these connections between the orbitofrontal cortex and the thalamus are actually, that the orbitofrontal cortex is actually down-regulating the thalamus and sort of modulating which ascending nociceptive information can actually ascend into the cortex. And the way that this happens, so potentially could happen, this is all a theory, there's this area called the thalamic reticular nucleus that has GABAergic or inhibitory projections to the thalamus that actually kind of modulates which type of information goes through the thalamus into the cortex. So the idea is that while you're meditating, engaging all those reappraisal mechanisms, non-judgmental awareness, shifting your attention from arising painful sensations to the breath, the idea is that what could be going on here is that that orbitofrontal cortex is online and is actually talking to the thalamus to regulate how much of that sensory information is actually reaching the cortex. And that could be a very kind of top-down mechanism through which meditation is decreasing pain. Moving on to kind of physiological mechanisms supporting mindfulness-based pain relief. So we have actually seen that meditation-induced reductions in pain are independent of reductions in respiration rate. This is really interesting because we kind of just went over a top-down mechanism through which meditation could be decreasing pain. But the whole process of meditation, it also engages bottom-up mechanisms that are, we've seen a lot, in a lot of other research that things like just lowering your breath can alleviate pain. So people could ask the question, how do we know that it's the actual reappraisal mechanisms involved in meditation that are mediating its analgesia? What if it's just reductions in respiration rate? Well, we showed that it was independent of reductions in respiration rate. Further, so people often can say, well, how do we know that it's not the placebo effect? Because placebo-induced analgesia is a very real thing. It's a great benefit to patients a lot of times. And it's an opiatergically mediated mechanism. However, we did a study, this was a study when I had just joined the lab, where we blasted participants with very high levels of naloxone, which is an opiate antagonist, and showed that naloxone did not block reductions in pain while people were meditating. So it's different than placebo-induced analgesia. And then, so for my doctoral work, I was interested in the role of the parasympathetic nervous system in mindfulness-based analgesia. We all know that reductions in respiration rate can reduce pain, but I was interested if there was a top-down mechanism through which meditation was engaging the parasympathetic nervous system in a way that could be maybe kind of like a biomarker for meditation-associated analgesia. So we used heart rate variability, high frequency heart rate variability as a marker of parasympathetic activity. It did show that meditation-associated decreases in pain unpleasantness are associated with higher parasympathetic activity independent of respiration rate and when compared to a placebo control. And there is some evidence that certain top-down mechanisms can engage the parasympathetic nervous system. So it could be maybe a sort of biomarker of this process. Again, that is very, very preliminary and not something I would hang my hat on, but something that does warrant in further studies and further examination. So something that one of one of our colleagues did really, well, not super recently, but he's been working on for a long time, is this mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement. So this was developed as incorporating mindfulness, reappraisal processes, and savoring to help people with actually opioid chronic pain patients who were using opiates. And it was found that this intervention decreases measures of pain, decreases opiate craving, and opiate misuse in chronic pain patients who are on long-term opiates. And further, the pain relieving effects were mediated through an individual's capacity to reappraise pain as innocuous sensory information. And that was a statistical mediation. So I think that's kind of fits in nicely with what we've been talking about. It's kind of a clinical application of the fact that these top-down reappraisal mechanisms that are maybe a corticothalamic process can even be engaged in patients who are already on opiates, who are chronic pain patients, to not only improve pain, but improve some addictive behaviors. So we often think of mindfulness as a way to, I guess, keep people off of opiates maybe. But I think what's really interesting, this is in like, I think phase 2 clinical trials now, but I think what's really interesting is that this is beyond that. This is for patients who are already on opiates. This can help them, you know, not escalate usage. So, you know, more research needs to be done to kind of figure out how meditation is working, who it's effective for. But I think it holds a lot of promise, especially given that it's a non-opioidergic mechanism. So it avoids cross-tolerance in people who are using opiates, since it's a different type of mechanism. So it can be used in tandem with opiates, basically. So that's kind of briefly what I had. This is the support that we had for all these studies. This was my PhD mentor, another one of my PhD mentors, and a lot of the people at Wake Forest who kind of helped a lot with this.